Morning mist drifts low across the plain. The sea is calm, almost indifferent. Gulls circle above a silence too heavy to be peace. The sand bears marks, shallow grooves, scattered armor, a single broken spear glinting in weak light. Beyond, ships rock gently in the bay, their sails stained red with dawn. This place should have been the grave of Athens, an ending so certain that even the gods might have looked away. Yet the quiet is not of defeat, but of something unimaginable having occurred. Smoke still curls where the campfires of empire once burned. A bronze helmet lies half buried, its crest torn. The world had come here expecting to witness submission, and instead it found defiance carved into the earth itself. The air hums with aftermath, the silence of the unthinkable made real. They were not soldiers, at least not by birth. Farmers, potters, sailors, smiths, men who had never seen empire but knew what freedom cost. 10,000 Athenians, joined by 3,000 from tiny Plataea, stood on open ground with no walls behind them. No cavalry, no retreat. Each carried a round bronze shield, a spear, and the weight of a city's future. Beside them, fathers and sons adjusted armor straps in silence. They were citizens, which meant they fought not for king or coin, but for one another. Across the line, dust rose from trembling hands gripping spear shafts. The horizon shimmered with heat and fear, but none stepped back. In that narrow space between terror and duty, Athens found its courage. They would not kneel. Not today, not ever again. Across the bay, an empire assembled. 600 Persian ships, black hulls gleaming like obsidian, stretched from shore to horizon. On the plain, the invaders formed ranks a mile wide, banners of gold and purple rippling in the morning wind. Their archers stood in endless lines, their cavalry restless and sleek. For Datis and Artaphernes, this was no war. It was punishment. Athens was a single rebellious city among millions, a spark to be crushed beneath the empire's heel. Their fleet alone outnumbered the entire Athenian population. From the dunes, Persian officers watched with quiet assurance. They had seen rebellions before and burned them all. Yet before sunset, the sand beneath their horses would drink their blood. On this quiet shore, the greatest power on earth had mistaken resolve for weakness. All across Ionia, cities had bowed. The islands paid tribute. The proud had bent the knee. Only Athens refused. Herodotus would later write, "They were the first of the Hellenes to face the Persians without fear." The words feel simple, but they cut through centuries of obedience. The Athenians did not pray for rescue or reason. They stood because the alternative was unthinkable. A life without voice, a city without soul. When the Spartan messengers failed to arrive, no one faltered. An old man whispered, "Then we stand alone." Around him, the phalanx tightened, shields locking with a sound like iron breath. What the Persians saw as folly, history would remember as birth. The first stand not for conquest, but for the right to stand at all. The plain of Marathon stretched like a trap, hemmed by mountains to the north, marsh to the south, and sea to the east. The Persians, vast but confined, faced an army too small to flee and too proud to die quietly. Both sides could see their own reflection in the stillness. Empire and defiance, mirror and blade. The air trembled with waiting. The Greeks anchored their center thin, their wings thickened, their minds already turning toward risk. Across the field, the Persian line shimmered in the rising light, a wave of armor, rhythm, and certainty. Between them lay 1,000 paces of grass and destiny. The chessboard was set, each square soaked in sunlight. Every move from here would be irreversible. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for courage to step first. Somewhere in the line, a hand clenched tighter around a spear. A heartbeat later, a shout broke the stillness. Low, ragged, human. The formation rippled forward. The Greeks were running, not in panic, but precision. Shields lifted, feet pounding the earth in rhythm. Across the plain, Persians scrambled to meet them, confused by the sight of free men charging without command. This was not madness. It was clarity, the knowledge that they had nothing left to lose but submission. By dusk, the sand would be red and the sea would carry the bodies of empire. But now, in this first terrible rush, the world tilted towards something new. Freedom, cornered and desperate, had bared its teeth. The gods themselves would pause to watch what came next. At dawn, Persepolis gleamed like a vision. Pillars of white stone caught the first light, their capitals carved with lions and bulls. The terraces shone with gold leaf and turquoise inlay. Around the palace gates, the empire moved in procession. Lydians in bright robes, Bactrians with camels, Ethiopians bearing ivory. Here was the world's center, where every horizon ended in allegiance. From the Indus to the Aegean, from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt, every land bent its knee to one name: Darius, King of Kings. His word was law, carved into stone and carried by wind. Armies were only the shadow of his will, 100 nations stitched together by tribute and fear. No rebellion lasted long under such order. None dared stand alone. None, until Athens. Vengeance came to Darius not as rage, but as ritual. Years before, rebels from Ionia had burned Sardis, his satrap's city, and among them were Athenian ships. They were nothing in his empire, yet they had touched his pride. He swore before Ahura Mazda that he would punish them. Each day, a servant was commanded to whisper as he dined, "Master, remember the Athenians." The phrase became a heartbeat of empire, steady, eternal, echoing down the halls of Persepolis. When Darius looked east to sunrise, he saw loyalty. When he looked west, he saw defiance that needed extinguishing. He did not hurry. Kings with eternity on their side never did. But the whisper never stopped, and neither did the ships he began to build. Across the sea stood a city that had no throne, no king, and too much noise. Athens, young, unsteady, fierce, was learning to govern itself by argument. Men gathered in the agora beneath the open sky, shouting, laughing, voting with raised hands. They had torn down their tyrants and replaced them not with silence but with speech. It was a fragile invention, this idea that every citizen had a voice, but it bound them tighter than fear ever could. The city smelled of olive oil, bronze, and dust. From the Nix Hill, where laws were debated, one could see the sea that had brought both trade and danger. They knew Persia was coming. They also knew submission would unmake them more completely than death. And so they prepared to stand. The Aegean darkened under sails. 600 Persian ships, their hulls black and curved like blades, swept westward with the tide. Beneath the decks, oars struck water in unison. A living rhythm, the heartbeat of vengeance. Datis and Artaphernes, Darius's chosen generals, commanded an army drawn from the empire's endless ranks. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, and Ionians bound by tribute and fear. The fleet devoured islands in its path. Naxos burned. Eretria fell. Each conquest was a message written in ash. Resistance is memory, and memory will be erased. At dawn, the horns sounded like thunder rolling across the sea. Ahead lay the Attic coast, a thin line of land where empire would meet experiment. And the wind carried the whisper of a king who had never forgotten. The Persians landed at Marathon, a wide, sunlit plain bordered by mountains and sea. It was perfect ground for their cavalry, open, level, defenseless. They built their camp by the shore, their banners snapping against the salt wind. They waited for Athens to surrender, as so many others had. The air was thick with certainty. Scouts reported no movement, no army in sight. For days, the Persians rested, their horses grazing on green fields that seemed already theirs. The sound of surf mixed with the creak of ships, the slow pulse of inevitability. Then, from beyond the olive hills, came the faint echo of marching feet. Not the tread of slaves, nor the order of empire, but the rhythm of men who chose to walk toward danger on their own terms. Through the silver leaves of the olive groves, they came, 10,000 Athenians, 3,000 allies from Plataea. No drums, no fanfare, only the clatter of bronze and breath. Farmers, sculptors, sailors, men who had never seen a king and had no word for empire. They marched not because they believed they could win, but because retreat meant forgetting who they were. Their armor caught the sunlight like a field of mirrors. Boys helped fathers fasten greaves. Old men carried the spears of their sons. Every step through the dust was a declaration. Athens would not bow. As they reached the plain, they could see the Persian camp shimmering by the sea. The greatest army on earth waited for submission. What came instead was defiance walking on bare earth, steady as destiny. They left Athens before sunrise, 10,000 men, shields on shoulders, armor glinting faintly in the half-light. The road to Marathon stretched 26 miles through dust and heat, each step carrying the weight of a city's future. There were no songs, no drums, only the rhythm of sandals on dry earth and the rasp of breath beneath bronze. Miltiades rode ahead, eyes fixed on the sea beyond the hills, knowing that hesitation meant ruin. Behind him marched citizens, not soldiers, their courage born not of training, but necessity. Every mile shortened the distance between defiance and annihilation. When they crested the final ridge and saw the Persian ships in the bay, no one spoke. The plain below shimmered in morning haze, a stage already set for something the world had never imagined, the moment when free men would decide history on foot. Messengers had ridden south, pleading for Sparta's aid. The reply returned like a stone dropped in silence. The priests had spoken. The moon was not yet full. Their sacred laws forbade marching to war. The most feared warriors in Greece would stay home, praying, waiting. In the Athenian camp, the news spread like cold through the ranks. There would be no reinforcements, no legendary Spartans arriving at dawn. Only 10,000 against a continent. Some men tightened their armor straps harder. Others stared east into the mist, jaw set. Alone or not, the Persians would still come. Miltiades said nothing. He only looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Then we are enough." The wind carried his words away, leaving the sound of waves breaking, as if the sea itself had answered. The two armies stood watching each other across the plain. 5 days passed. No one moved. Between them lay a mile of grass and tension. The Persians waited for the Athenians to break, for hunger, fear, or time to do their work. The Greeks waited for the gods to blink, for an opening, for anything. The sun rose and fell, turning shields to mirrors by day and cold iron by night. Horses stamped in the Persian lines. Campfires smoked and went out. Men sharpened spears not for use, but to silence the sound of their hearts. By the 6th dawn, even the wind seemed to pause. Across the field, the invaders began to move, not toward battle, but toward their ships. And Miltiades saw it. Persian cavalry, their deadliest force, began to embark, waves slapping against black hulls. Perhaps they meant to sail south and strike Athens undefended. Or perhaps it was fate. Miltiades did not care. He saw what others hesitated to name. The empire was divided, and division was weakness. He gathered his generals beneath the olive trees and spoke quietly, his voice flat with exhaustion and certainty. "If we wait," he said, "Athens burns. If we strike now, we strike for the world." No cheers followed, only nods, hard and final. He turned to the men assembling on the ridge. Below, the Persian lines shimmered in the rising sun. The chance was narrow as a blade's edge. But freedom, he thought, was always cut from narrow things. Dawn broke red over the sea. 8,000 men formed the Athenian center. 3,000 Plataeans held the flank. Miltiades had ordered the wings deep and strong, the middle deliberately thin, a risk no one else would have dared. Across the field, the Persians stretched endless and glittering, confident as the tide. Then came the sound, one long, low trumpet. Shields locked, spears angled forward, and suddenly the Greeks began to move. First a walk, then a jog, then a charge. 800 meters across open ground, into arrows, into empire, into eternity. The Persians blinked in disbelief. No one had ever charged them before. Arrows rose like black rain. The Greeks did not stop. Dust billowed. Bronze flashed. The line was no longer a line. It was a wave. The plain of Marathon trembled under running feet. Armor rattled. Shields struck rhythm. Chants to Enyalius, the god of war, rolled across the field like thunder. Persian archers drew, loosed, and filled the sky. Arrows fell in sheets, hissing through air, thudding against bronze. Still the Greeks came, their formation tight, their voices rising above the storm. The first impact was not seen but felt. A dull, seismic crash as two worlds collided. Sand erupted. Spears splintered. Men vanished into a blur of dust and sound. For a heartbeat, all motion froze. Then the battle roared to life. On that mile of plain between the mountains and the sea, the idea of freedom struck the empire of kings like lightning. The world would never be the same again. The charge struck like a storm breaking. For seconds, there was only the sound. Bronze colliding with bone, the tearing of air, the shudder of earth. The Persian front had expected a pause, a parley, a wall of arrows to thin the line. Instead came the impossible. 10,000 men running full tilt, shields locked, eyes blazing beneath crested helms. Dust erupted upward, swallowing sunlight. The first impact sent shockwaves through the Persian ranks. Spears splintered, shields cracked. Men fell backward into one another. It was not an orderly advance. It was a collision of conviction against empire. Horses reared and screamed. Arrows loosed too late hissed past, finding nothing but sand. The archers had no time to draw again before the phalanx was upon them. a wall of bronze and will. At the heart of the battle, the thin Greek center began to give. The Persian immortals, armored in scale and silk, surged forward, pressing hard. Shields buckled, spears snapped, the ground slicked red. For a heartbeat, the Athenian line wavered, and the empire's tide threatened to break through. Miltiades had expected this. His plan was carved into the ground itself. The center meant to bend, not shatter, while the wings gathered strength like drawn bows. Persian generals shouted in triumph, thinking the Greeks were collapsing. But behind them, the trap was already closing. The left and right flanks, thicker, heavier, began to pivot inward. The immortals, for all their glory, never saw the jaws forming around them. From the ridge above, it would have looked like the sea folding in upon itself. Bronze on both sides sweeping inward, a gleaming crescent crushing the Persian center. Dust and cries rose like a single voice. The Persians turned to find no escape. Their own numbers now a prison. Spears thrust from all sides, shields pressing closer, until movement itself became impossible. It was the first time in history that freedom had learned strategy. The double envelopment, a maneuver no Greek had ever attempted, was working with merciless precision. Men who had ruled from Egypt to the Indus now found themselves trapped on a strip of sand, hemmed in by those they had once called rebels. A soldier dropped his sword and stared skyward, realizing too late that the gods had changed sides. The noise fell away, replaced by the sound of breath. Ragged, wet, human. There was no formation now, only chaos. Arrows fired point blank, blades slashed through smoke and sweat. The Persians fought bravely, striking even as they died, their curved swords glinting in the broken light. But there was nowhere left to go. The press of bodies crushed men before blades reached them. The sand turned dark beneath their feet, slick and shifting. One Athenian dropped his shield and vomited from exhaustion, then picked it up again. Another slipped and was trampled by his own line. Victory had no music, only rhythm, the mechanical sound of survival. When the dust cleared, the phalanx still stood, breathing hard, unmoving amid silence and ruin. At last, the Persian ranks broke. Thousands turned and ran for the sea, tripping over the fallen, throwing weapons aside. The Greeks followed, not out of rage but momentum that could not stop. Down the slope, through smoke, into surf, Herodotus wrote, "They fell in heaps at the sea." It was true. Men stumbled into waves that turned crimson, their bodies tossed by the tide as the living pressed forward. Ships pushed off in panic, archers firing wildly from decks. Some Persians swam, reaching for oars slick with blood. The Athenians waded after them, spears plunging through foam, armor gleaming beneath the rising sun. When it was over, the sea began to swallow what it had witnessed. Waves washed over shields, over the dead, over the first empire ever beaten by citizens. When the counting ended, 6,000 Persians lay dead upon the beach. The Athenians had lost 192. Herodotus lists no names, only the number, stark and holy. They were not warriors by birth, only men who ran toward fate and found eternity instead. The survivors stood among the fallen, too tired to speak. The air smelled of salt and iron, the surf whispering against the shore. They had no songs for what they had done. They buried their dead on the field itself, marking the mound with no inscription, only earth over bronze, silence over glory. The empire would sail away, but its shadow would never recover from this single morning. On that plain, the gods of power fell, and the world learned the price of freedom. The cheers had barely faded when the horizon shifted. Persian sails, black against the sunlit sea, were not fleeing. They were turning south. A murmur rippled through the Greek ranks like wind through dry grass. Miltiades saw it first, eyes narrowing toward Cape Sunion. The fleet was sailing to Athens, undefended, unaware. For a heartbeat, victory tasted like ash. The men who had just survived the impossible now understood. Their wives, their children, their city lay open. "We march," Miltiades said simply. No orders, no rest, no hesitation. Spears lifted again, shields slung across backs still streaked with blood. The plain of Marathon fell silent behind them, filled with the dead, Greek and Persian alike, as the living turned toward one last trial and the road home. They ran. Not the sprint of battle, but the endless grind of endurance. 40 kilometers of sun, stone, and salt on skin. Sandals struck dust until it rose in clouds behind them. Shields clattered against sweat-slicked backs. Bronze burned like fire beneath the afternoon glare. Men fell, stumbled, rose again. The wounded were dragged by comrades who could barely stand. There were no drums, no songs, only the rasp of breath and the rhythm of sandals on earth. Each step was a heartbeat, each mile a prayer. They had left victory behind them, but carried its weight like armor. Somewhere ahead lay Athens, and behind them the sea still glimmered with Persian sails. The race was not for glory now. It was to reach their city before history did. Night fell as they crested the last rise. Below, the dark sea burned with torchlight, Persian triremes sliding toward the beach, oars flashing like blades. The Athenians descended in silence, forming ranks along the sand. Torches flickered over their armor. The line of shields shone like a wall of molten gold. The wind carried no words, only the whisper of surf against steel. From the ships came shouting, commands, confusion. Then slowly, the Persian fleet began to turn. They had seen what waited. The same men they thought broken now standing again, unflinching. The oars dipped, and the ships withdrew into the fog. On the shore, no one spoke. The soldiers stood still, breathing as one. Too exhausted for triumph, too alive for belief. Athens was safe. The legend says one man ran ahead. A messenger named Phidippides. He carried no weapon, only a heartbeat stretched thin between life and news. Through dust, over hills, he ran, the city's salvation pounding in his chest. By the time he reached Athens, night was breaking into dawn. The assembly doors opened, and the people turned as he stumbled inside. His voice was raw, stripped of everything but truth. "Rejoice," he said, "we are victorious." Then he fell, breath spent, body silent. Whether myth or memory, his story endured because it felt inevitable. Marathon had demanded one final sacrifice, not of steel, but of breath. His death was not tragedy, but completion. The last echo of men who refused to stop running. When the dawn rose over Marathon once more, the Athenians returned to bury their dead, not with statues or names, but with earth. One mound for all. 192 citizens lay beneath it, their shields stacked, their spears planted upright in silence. No inscription marked their rest. The city knew their names by heart. The mound was left smooth, bare, a wound sealed by time. Herodotus wrote only their number, but the soil itself remembered. Even now, after 25 centuries, the tumulus still rises above the plain. Olive trees whispering over it, wind bending the grass. A monument not to conquest, but to unity, where citizens became warriors and warriors became legend. When the Persians turned away, the Greeks did not cheer. They sank to their knees on the shore, armor dented, lungs raw, the world suddenly still. The battle, the march, the run, it had all been one unbroken breath held against annihilation, and now that breath was released. The war was won not only by bronze, but by the will to move when every muscle begged to stop. This was Marathon's true miracle, not the killing, but the endurance. The strength to fight, to run, and still stand waiting when the enemy returned. The sea breeze cooled their faces. The stars came out. Freedom, they realized, was not a gift. It was the distance between collapse and continuation. And tonight, that distance was exactly 40 kilometers long. It began with a city that should have fallen. Athens, a place of potters and shipwrights, traders and thinkers, stood without walls, without cavalry, without a king. Yet when the mightiest empire in history came to erase it, the citizens did not yield. They lifted shields forged in workshops and marched together, not because they were commanded, but because they chose. The Persian kings ruled nations through fear. The Athenians fought through belief. On that open plain, ordinary men defended something invisible, the right to stand on their own soil as free men. The sea wind carried their battle cries beyond the mountains, beyond time. And when the dust settled, the world had changed. A city of artisans had defeated the masters of an empire. No kings gave the order at Marathon. No generals spoke for gods. The Athenians voted to fight, citizens in assembly, raising hands instead of swords. Each man who marched did so by his own will, knowing the price. This was not just a clash of armies. It was an idea made flesh, that power could belong to those who shared it. The phalanx became democracy's armor, each shield overlapping the next, each life bound to another. When they charged, it was the sound of freedom learning how to strike. And when they stood, shoulder to shoulder, they proved that self-governed men could defend themselves better than any king's slaves. From that moment onward, war itself carried a new voice, not of conquest, but of citizenship armed with conviction. Darius raged in his palaces of gold and stone. He vowed to blot out the name of Athens from the earth, to send armies until the insult was burned from memory. But memory is faster than vengeance. The tale of Marathon sailed home on every returning ship, whispered through markets and temples, spreading like light. 10 years later, his son Xerxes marched with 1 million men across bridges of boats, through mountains of dust, to reclaim his father's pride. Yet even that ocean of soldiers could not undo what had already been born on that plain. The knowledge that courage could stand taller than empire. Marathon had written itself into history, not in ink, but in human possibility, and even kings could not erase it. The lesson of Marathon was carved not into marble, but into the mind of humankind. It said that numbers are not destiny, that fear is not fate. Empires rely on counting, legions, ships, gold, but freedom counts differently. It measures hearts, not bodies. When people choose to fight for their own voice, they summon something that cannot be weighed or ruled. The Persians brought 10 for everyone. The Athenians brought belief for every 10, and belief outlasts numbers. Across centuries, that same pattern repeats. Wherever tyranny rises, so too does the quiet defiance of those who refuse to kneel. Marathon was the first time the world saw that equation written in blood, and realized how unbreakable it was. Today, the plain of Marathon is quiet. Olive trees bend in the wind. The Aegean glitters beyond the hills. The mound of the 192 still rises from the earth, not a tomb, but a memory with roots. Every year, runners trace the same road their ancestors once ran, from the battlefield to the city, from survival to remembrance. Their breath becomes prayer. Their rhythm echoes that first desperate march. They are not racing the Persians anymore. They are racing time, keeping the flame from going out. The field that once shook with bronze and blood now trembles only with footsteps. And yet, in every runner's pulse, the heartbeat of that ancient morning still endures. Empires rise, empires fade, but the idea born at Marathon does not die. It moves through centuries, through nations, through every hand that votes, every voice that resists, every runner who carries a message forward. Herodotus ended his tale with simple awe. The day of Marathon would be remembered for all time. He was right, because Marathon was not a victory, it was a declaration that free men will fight for themselves, and that such men are very hard to conquer. The sun lifts over the Aegean, the olive branches stir, the mound glows with morning light. The war is long over, yet the run continues, across ages, across hearts. The echo of freedom never fades, it just keeps running.